Today we're going to talk about opposites and absolute values. So we're going to continue with our Mr. Numberline poetry to live by. So going from where we left off in the last time, we said, can we put them all in order, plot the points? And we just might, because the number that is greater is the number on the right. We're going to continue today with adding some poetry on opposites. It goes, opposites are easy, just switch the sign or go the same distance on the far side of Mr. Number Line. Here's what that means. The opposite of a positive number is going to be that exact same number but with a negative sign in front of it. And vice versa. The opposite of a negative number is going to be that same number but with no negative sign in front of it. Now sometimes people do put the plus sign just to indicate that something is positive. You do not need to do that. It is assumed that if a number is standing on its own, it is positive. It was only negative if it includes the negative sign. So let's look at this example. It says, what is the opposite of the integer 5? And we're going to go through these steps. Step 1, we note that 5 is 5 units from the origin. Remember, the origin is 0. 5 is 5 places to the right of 0 at positive 5. So step number 2, we know that if we start at the origin and move 5 places to the left, 5 units in the other direction, that will find the opposite right there at negative 5. Therefore, the opposite of 5 is negative 5. We write it like this. So real quick, let me show you what this means. If you have a negative sign, parentheses 5, that is the exact same thing as saying the opposite of 5. So this outside of the parentheses means take the opposite of whatever is inside of the parentheses. So the opposite of 5, because 5 is inside the parentheses. So the opposite of 5 is negative 5. Let's do another example. It says, what is the opposite of the integer negative 6? Step 1, we note that negative 6 is 6 units to the left of the origin, right there at negative 6. Step 2, we can start at the origin and go 6 places to the opposite side or to the right, which is going to land us right here at 6. So we are going to go plus 6 to the opposite side. So the opposite of negative 6 is positive 6. You could also write it as the opposite of negative 6, which is going to be positive 6. The opposite of negative 6. Now I want you to try A through E without using Mr. Numberline. Pause the video. When you're ready, press play again and check your answers. Go ahead and check your answers. And now we're going to review some key points to remember about opposites. So the sum, meaning if you were to add together the number and its opposite, it will always get you back to 0. So if you go from 6 and you add the integer, the opposite negative 6, that would get you right back to 0 and vice versa, no matter which way you go. Another point to ponder is there is only one integer whose opposite is equal to itself, and that integer is 0. 0 is neither positive nor negative, therefore it doesn't necessarily have an opposite. Finding the opposite of an integer should not be confused with flipping the integer over. For example, the opposite of 5 is not 1/5. This flipped over version of every number is called the reciprocal. Remember, we use reciprocal when dividing fractions. We do not use the reciprocal anytime we're working with integers. Now let's talk about absolute values. Absolute values are very different from opposites, so pay attention. Here's some integer poetry to live by. We will review what we've done and we will add on. It goes, can we put them all in order? Plot the points, and we just might, because the number that is greater is the number to the right. Opposites are easy, just switch the sign or go the same distance on the far side of Mr. Number Line. An absolute value is happy. It feels like a hero because it's the positive distance of the number from 0. So when we talk about absolute value, one of the main things that we can talk about is distances. Anytime we're talking about distances, we're talking about a positive value. However, something to remember is we have something called sea level. Sea level is at 0. If you were to dive and go see some fish down below, you would be under the sea level, which would be a negative value. So you were at negative 5 feet under the sea level. However, if you were talking about what's your distance from the sea level, it would be 5 because distance is always used as an absolute value. So let's try an example. It says, what's the absolute value of the integer 6? Okay, well, 6, remember, it is the positive distance of the integer 6 from the origin. So going from the origin to 6, you're moving positive 6. Therefore, the absolute value is still just 6. So the absolute value of 6 is just 6. It's already positive. It gets to stay the same. The absolute value sign are these two lines. They are different from parentheses, so we need to be very careful. So saying this is the exact same thing as saying the absolute value of 6. So the absolute value with those lines of whatever's inside. So again, the absolute value of 6 is just 6. It stays the same. Let's try another example. What is the absolute value of the integer negative 6? It is still going to be the positive. I'm just going to use a plus sign for now just to abbreviate. It is still the positive distance of the integer negative 6 from the origin. So going from the origin and negative 6, you have to move positive 6 to get back to the origin. So what's the distance? It is a positive 6. So the absolute value of negative 6 is positive 6. Again, we can write it like the absolute value. Don't forget, it's those two lines. They wanted you to fill them in this time. We write it like the absolute value of negative 6, and it remains positive 6 again. So it is the positive distance of the number to the origin. In other words, it's just whatever that integer is in a positive form. If it's already positive, it stays the same. If it's negative, it turns to positive. Try A through E by pausing the video, and then when you're ready to check your answers, you may play the video. Before I do number E, I want you to really look at it. Notice what it says. It's got a negative sign outside the absolute value sign. This negative sign right here says the opposite of. So I want to know, what is the opposite of the absolute value of negative 1? So you're going to start by doing the absolute value of negative 1. What is the absolute value of negative 1? It is 1. Now it wants you to take the opposite. So this is a two-step problem. What is the opposite of 1? Negative 1. So you need to be very careful for problems like that. Notice that it has those absolute value signs. It's different than saying what's the opposite of negative 1 versus the opposite of the absolute value of negative 1. These are going to be two different answers. The opposite of negative 1 is a positive 1. But the opposite of the absolute value of negative 1 stays negative 1. Again, the absolute value of negative 1 is 1. Take the opposite of that, gets you back to negative 1. So be very careful with problems like E. Let's review some key points to remember about absolute values. Unlike opposites, which can be negative or positive, absolute values are always positive. For all negative integers, the absolute value equals its opposite. It equals the opposite of the integer. That's only true for negative integers. For non-negative integers, the absolute value of the integer equals itself. In other words, if it's a positive integer, it stays positive, it stays the same. Now guys, that was a lot of information. So make sure if you need to, you rewatch the video and you've got all of these notes ready to go so that you can reference them when needed, if needed.